Well, welcome everyone. It's really good to see some new faces in the room. So I wouldn't normally bother introducing myself, but I will. I'm Saul Cunningham. I'm the director of the Fenner School, and we've got a great seminar lined up today. And in some ways, it's marking what we hope to be a rejuvenated seminar program. So hopefully there'll be many more great seminars which you'll come along to as well. So I want to first acknowledge that we're on the land of Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And when we listen to today's presentation, we should think about the millennia of connection that people have had with animals, and especially birds, in this landscape. And I think that connection between people and birds is something that's central to what Lewis is doing at the moment on your visit to Australia. And I don't know how much that's going to come out of this presentation. We'll let that be a surprise. Yeah. So our speaker today is Professor Luis Miguel Renjifo. And now I'm going to try to pronounce the name of the university you've come from, and you can assess my Spanish accent. So Luis comes from Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Colombia. Thank you. Luis has an abiding interest in birds and in the importance of birds to people. His current work involves studying the motivations of why people go bird watching. And is doing that in collaboration with colleagues from social sciences and engineering. And he is, of course, an enthusiastic conservationist and birdwatcher himself, has just returned from a trip to Lake Mungo for a week or something, in which he did not see an alleyfowl, but you know, it's otherwise a successful trip, I believe. Lewis has studied extinction risk in Colombian bird species since the late 1980s. His work on the effects of landscape change and composition of forest birds and the development of management tools for biodiversity conservation in rural landscapes led to the first establishment of biological corridors in South America. Lewis has also led the design of the first national strategy for conservation of birds in Colombia. And I should also say he's been a visitor for many weeks now, six weeks. And it's been a real pleasure to have Lewis around. I've certainly enjoyed his company. I know many others have had their adventures with him on the trip so far. So thank you for visiting us, and we hope it's not the only time. And so the talk today is titled Tracking Extinction Risk Trends and Patterns in a Megadiverse Country, and it will address conservation, public policy, and knowledge. Thanks. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Saul, for the introduction, and for all of you for being here, and those here in person and those that are by internet online. So this talk is divided in these 4 blocks. First, I'm going to talk about extinction risk assessments and red data books. Then I will move on to make an introduction on Colombian biodiversity and bird diversity in the country. And then I will move on to talk about the Colombian red data books, mostly about the red data book published in 2016, but I will also touch on the one that was published in 2002. And I will explain how we use the Colombian red data books to obtain a red list index for the birds of Colombia. So that's the plan. So extinction risk assessment has become a fundamental tool for conservation planning and practice. The process of undertaking these assessments not only produces the assessments of each individual species, but also involves compiling an extraordinary amount of information that is used for those assessments. So red data books provide support for a variety of actions, such as definition of conservation priorities, allocation of funds, but also they are important for environmental education and raising awareness regarding the biodiversity crisis. The click is not working. So the first red data books were published in 1966, and they are based on a system of criteria and categories defined by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And this system is regarded as the gold standard for extinction risk assessments. The current system was adopted in the year 2001 and still works until today with minor changes. And I was senior author of the Red Data Books and Red List for the birds of Colombia in the years 1998, 2002, and the last one was published in 2 volumes. One of them is circulating around. The first one was published in 2014, and the second in 2016, and this should be done every 10 years. So I'm going to talk briefly about the nature of these criteria and categories of the defined by the IUCN. So here we have the criteria, and think about the criteria like the symptoms of a disease, not the diagnosis. The diagnosis is when you go through the process. So it's like the symptoms of a disease. You may have tumors, you may have swelling, fever, whatever. So those symptoms that you assess are 5, and you don't choose which ones. You have to do it for every single one using every single piece of information that is available. So the first criteria is if a species is undergoing a rapid decline in population size. It is not the population itself, it's the rate of decline. So a species can be in the millions, but it is declining rapidly, it could be under threat. The second one, criteria being, if a species has a small, fragmented, and declining distribution, or fluctuating distribution. C is if a species has a small population, and that population is declining. And I should mention 2 things. For the rapid decline, the period of time that is assessed is either 10 years or 3 generations for the species, whichever is longer. So for a whale, is many years, or an orchid can be many years, but it is for an annual plant is 10 years, right? And the measurement of the distribution is conducted in 2 ways, and you have to do both. One is extent of occurrence, and that is measured as the minimum convex polygon that you can draw around the entire distribution of the species. That's extent of occurrence. And the other way you do is area of occupancy. That is the area that is, in fact, occupied by the species. So coming back to C, that is if a species has a small population and it is declining. D has two ways to go, is if a species has a very small distribution or a very small population and that is combined with a threat. And E is if you conduct a quantitative analysis, and that analysis indicates that there is a high probability of extinction for the species. So with the use of a number of sub-criteria, quantitative thresholds, you can find out if the species is under threat or not. So that's the diagnosis. And you can also assess which level of threat. So the categories of the IUCN, and probably many of you or all of you are familiar with this, but I'm going to say because I don't know. So when a species is assessed, you can end up with data deficient species. So that means that you don't have enough information to know what the status of the species is. But if you do, then that species can be of least concern, near threatened, or can be threatened. But if it is threatened, it can be vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And a species might as well be extinct. So a little bit about Colombia and Colombian biodiversity. So Colombia is located in the northwest corner, have a pointer, sorry. Colombia is located in the northwest corner of South America, where South America meets the Caribbean with all its biogeographic influence. And more importantly, is also the point of contact of North America with South America across the Central American Isthmus. It is considered one of the world's mega diverse countries, and it hosts close to 10% of the world biodiversity. And to give you some examples, there are more bird, amphibian, butterfly, and frog species in Colombia than anywhere else in the world, and is second to Brazil in the number of plants and freshwater fish. So in fact, per square kilometer, Colombia is the most biodiverse country in the world. So it basically is as diverse as a country gets. And the reason for this is an astonishing diversity of ecosystems. So Colombia is on the equator, and this is a map of the potential ecosystem for the country. The country was originally covered in 80% of the country was covered by different types of forest, 18% by savanna or other type of open vegetation, including desert, thorn scrub, and the like, and 2% paramo. And I'm sure you know what forest, savanna, and desert is, but probably are not aware of paramo. So a couple slides regarding paramo. Paramo is this tundra-like biome that is located above tree line, and it's a very recent biome. It started to form by the end of the Pliocene and experienced an explosive radiation of plants in many groups. So it is considered the fastest evolving flora in the world, and it has the richest flora among alpine vegetation types in the world. And one of the characteristic traits are these rosettes. We call them frailejones. They are very slow growing. So I'm starting by one that is probably a couple centuries years old, because it's so cold that all plants grow very little. Just to mention, you have paramo when the average year temperature is 3 degrees or less. So plants grow very slow. And here I want to show the dark bands. The black bands is the organic soil, and the in more pale color are the deposits of volcanic ash of different eruptions. So this is on a volcano. So as I mentioned, Colombia is the second most biodiverse country in the world. By the year 2017, there were 56,000 species that were identified within the country, of which 22,000 were plants. From those, 4,000 are orchids, and we had by then 1,121 species of birds. By this year, this number has grown to 75,000, so it's growing fast. So Colombia has close to 20% of the bird species in the world, and many of the groups of aquatic birds like shorebirds, ocean birds, freshwater birds are basically the same that here, and some of the land birds also are the same, like the raptors. But many groups are New World families and orders. So these are hummingbirds. You're probably very familiar with them. This is my favorite. The length of the bill of the hummingbird is longer than the rest of the bird. And you can see it. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have this hummingbird with very thin and very short bill, and many others. And there are a number of groups that are very old and some that are very recent. And for instance, this is a tinamou. Tinamou is the sister group for the large flightless birds as emus and ostriches, so they are the sister group. And passerines is the largest order of birds. About half of the birds in the world are passerines, and they are divided into main groups: suboscines and oscines. Oscines are everywhere in all the continents, but suboscines are very poorly represented in the whole world. For instance, in Australia, you have pitas, like the rainbow and pita, and you have broadbills in Africa and Asia, but they are very diverse in the New World. So you have wood creepers like this, cotingas, manakins, tyrant flatcatchers, that is the largest bird family in the world, 455 species, many ant birds, but also you have many groups that are not suboscine, but oscines. The example that I brought is tanagers. Most of them are fruit-eating birds. They also feed on insects, but some of them are very different in their ecology. Some of them are seed eaters. In fact, they are called seed eaters, surprisingly. And some of them feed on nectar as honey eaters do. And you can see here a honey creeper that resembles in shape to some honey eaters and ecology. So we had some particular challenges for the red data book for the birds of Colombia. And one of them is the large number of species we had. And we also had many species that are poorly known and obviously limited funding. So we had to be creative. And creativity involved collaboration. So what we did is that we invited many ornithologists, basically Colombian, but also from elsewhere, to participate and made part of the group that was doing this. So we had 155 co-authors who compiled the species accounts with information that we use for the assessments. We also use citizen science to obtain highly accurate records for distribution models. And these highly accurate methods are crucial because we have very steep gradients. So if a record is not very accurate, it actually makes it very difficult to do a good model. And this was important not only because we got access to much more information that we could have gotten otherwise, but also created a sense of ownership. So this was not the red data book of a couple of people, but it was the red data book of all these people. And we had also a core group of scientists that we did the assessments themselves. So collaboration, obviously I'm not going to go in detail, but we have funding and support from different institutions, and we had these 55 authors for the species accounts, and we have 238 collaborators who were part of the project in some way. And I have to say, very creative in the way we use the methods. So for instance, we use distribution models for the species. And in this way, I'm going to be a little bit more detailed. We could measure extent of occurrence that I explained later. This is the minimum convex polygon. In green, you have the habitat that is left for that out species. In red is the habitat that has been lost. This line is the Western Andes above 1,000 meters, and this is the Pacific coast. So we could measure or get an estimate of what is the distribution of the species, extent of occurrence, and area of occupancy. And we use niche modeling combined with expert knowledge and multitemporal data on vegetation cover to estimate the extent and speed of habitat loss as a proxy for population change for those species that have very strict habitat associations, which are actually many or most in Colombia. And we also use models and information on population densities to estimate population size. And obviously, this process has many limitations. I'm sure that you have many in your minds already, and there are probably more. But we produce quantitative data in an explicit way. And every quantitative data point that we use is published in the book we are circulating. And that is important because it can be criticized. But these kind of processes of assessing risk assessment are very often a black box process, and you don't know where the data came from. So you can check on the internet those assessments, and they give you the data, but they don't give you how they got it. So I think this is important. So for the year 2016, this is published in 2 volumes, as I said. We had 1 extinct species, the Colombian grebe, here shown in a painting, and 140 threatened species. Of those 140 threatened species, 56 are endemic to Colombia, and from these 140, 16 are in critical danger of extinction, 56 are endangered, 67 are vulnerable, and we also have 28 near threatened species and 9 data deficient. So we have threatened species almost across the entire country, but as you will see, they are very unevenly distributed. So here, the Andes are represented in green, and you have 59 species in different parts of the Andes that are really at high proportion. Another 19 species are found in open ecosystems that may be savanna, desert, thorn scrub, and that's represented in orange. Another 16 species are lowland species, represented here in purple. Notice that the Amazon, which is rainforest, is not in color. We had also 11 species that are endemic to the Santa Marta Mountains here. Another 11 species that are endemic to the Darien Mountains, and they are so small that they cannot be seen at this scale of representation. We also had 6 insular species. Most of them are either from the island of San Andres or Providencia or both, but 1 species is from the islands on the Amazon, on the rivers of the Amazon. So we have this suite of species that are specialized on river islands. They could go to mainland, but they don't. Yeah, so we have one of those species is threatened. It is actually a large bird. It's the size of a bush turkey, and it's actually related to the bush turkey, but obviously far. And we also had 3 marine species that are threatened. 2 of those only nest on the island of Malpelo here and the Galapagos Island. The other ones nest elsewhere. Okay, and all of these species are declared threatened by the Colombian government, by the Ministry of the Environment, and that has legal consequences. So I'm going to go back a little bit to talk about collaboration and coordination, because before we even got started with research, it's very important to convince the Ministry of the Environment that we need a red data book. Because if we don't do that, we don't have an impact on public policy. So it takes a lot of effort, but we managed to do it at both times. And this coordination was particularly demanding and important, I would say, for the books that were published in the year 2002. Because in the year 2002, it was the President of the Republic who presented the books, 7 books, 3 on marine plants and animals, and 4 on marine plants and animals. So in the same event, the Ministry of the Environment declared those species in those 7 books legally threatened. So it's not often that you have research become public policy the same day, not to mention the same hour. So that was encouraging. And going back, to the Red Data book in 2016. I know this is in Spanish. I'm going to walk you through that. But we have here is, sorry, this is the number. This is not working. This is the number of species that are under risk by a particular type of threat. So in orange, we have vulnerable species. In blue, we have endangered species. And in purple, we have critically endangered species. And you can see most species are endangered by more than one. And this is the classification of IUCN, and we included a threat, and it's going to be obvious why. So here we have agriculture, cattle ranching, or basically ranching, hunting, illicit crops, very important in Colombia, modifications to natural systems, timber extraction, production of energy and mining, invasive species, transport and corridors of service, development for housing and commerce, pollution, climatic events, and intrusion by people. So this is obviously a very different set of threats that you have for endangered species in Australia, where invasive species is very important. And I should mention that invasive species, in combination of the absence of large predators, is very important in Australia. Sorry, this is not going below. And it is not fitting. Sorry, this, I cannot get to my slide. Oh, like this.
Elsie, can you direct on the screen? That's great. Tell me where the mouse is. Where? Oh, there it is.
All right. Thanks. Thank you. So by the year 2002, we had 112 threatened species, and by the year 2016, we had 140. But what does that even mean? Is that better? Is that worse? We don't know, because for this time period, we have much better information on the ecology, threats, etc. Multitemporal data on data on ecosystem change that we didn't have before. We had access to species niche modeling that we didn't have for 2002, and even 8 threatened species are new species for science. So we didn't know they were threatened because we didn't even know they exist. And of course, not every new species for science is threatened. So we also had many taxonomic changes. So in order to track the extinction risk and trends in Colombia, we obtained a red list index for the country, so for the birds of Colombia. And to do this, Angela Maria Maya and myself from Javeriana University collaborated with Stuart Butcher. And Stuart Butcher is a scientist at BirdLife International and University of Cambridge. And I probably should mention that Stuart is the person who led the development of the red indexes. So he knows about this. So periodic risk assessments allows for monitoring trends over time and provide insights onto the effectiveness of conservation policies. You should conduct extinction risk assessments at least every 10 years. That's what you're supposed to do. And the red list index was developed to allow for meaningful comparisons using repeated risk assessments. So this index illustrates the rate at which groups of species change in their overall level of extinction risk. So they are calculated from the number of the species in the red list and those that have undergone genuine changes. So those species that change in status because you know more about them, or there is a taxonomic change, are excluded from the index, because the reason is not that they are doing better or that they are doing worse, is that you know more about them. And so you get started with a complete list of the species. It could be for Australia, it could be for New South Wales. A larger scale is obviously better than a narrow scale. And then you exclude data deficient species because you don't know what the status is. Then you remove transient migrants, those that cross the country but don't stay in the country for some period of time, vagrants, and introduced species. And then we calculated the red list index for each time point. This is 2002 and 2016, assigning an equal step weight for each category. So this is 0 for low concern, 1 for near threatened, 2 for vulnerable, 3 for endangered. I'm sorry, 0 for low concern, 1 for near threatened, 2 for vulnerable, 3 for endangered, 4 for critical endangered, and 5 for extinct. And the number of species in each category was multiplied by this weight. And the progress were added, they were summed. The total is divided by the maximum possible number. So the total number of species multiplied by 5. And that is subtracted from 1. And you get the index. So the index goes from 0 to 1. 1 means that all species are of least concern. 0 means all species are extinct. So you get the idea. So we obtain this red list index for the country, for regions, for ecosystems, and for species or group of species of special concern. And I have to mention also that assessments in 2002 had to be backcasted, meaning that we have to do the assessment with the level of information we had in 2016, not with the level of information we have in 2002, right? So here are our results. From 1,909 species, of which 1,727 are either residents or seasonal residents. This means birds that come from other countries, either temperate or intratropical migrants. And we already know that we have 140 threatened species. That is 8.1% of the total number of species in the country, which is a much lower proportion than it is in the country, in the world. In the world, you have 13.6% of bird species that are threatened. And that's a significant difference. We also found a higher proportion of species that underwent extinction since the 16th century. So the cutting point is 1050. And so the proportion of extinct species is greater in the world than in Colombia. And I have to talk a little bit about the reason for those changes. So most changes in categories were due to increased knowledge. So 81% of changes that we had were due because of increased knowledge on the species or the ecosystems. And a smaller proportion, 18.6%, that change was due to genuine improvements or deteriorations of the conservation status of birds. So 3 were downlisted, meaning they are doing better, and 13 were uplisted, meaning they are doing worse. And the reason for this uplisting for these 3 species is land abandonment, conservation action, and the reduction in the rate of habitat loss. For those species that were uplisted, the main causes are illicit coca crops, 8 species. This is for cocaine. Hunting, 7 species. Invasive and domestic animals, mostly cats, dogs, and trout, 3 species. Cattle ranching, 3 species. Timber, 2 species. Timber extraction, 2 species. Illegal mining and oil production, 2 species. Water pollution, 1 species. And housing, 1 species. So please notice that these threats are different for species that are changing in category than for the whole group of 140 species. I mean, they are the same threats, but the relevance is different. So we divided the country in these regions. So this is the Caribbean Sea and coast. These are the islands of San Andres and Providencia. Here we have Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, a very high mountain, the Caribbean region, the Andean region, the Pacific region, the Pacific Ocean and coast, the mountains along the border with Panama, the Darien Mountains, Orinoquia, here in orange, and that's mostly savanna and forest, and the Amazonian region that is mostly forest and a little bit of savanna. So here are our red list index. So remember, it goes from 0 to 1. The highest it is, the better the group that is analyzed it is. So there is 1, and it's declining. Here we have the overall trend for Colombia. And notice that for the Andes, I'm actually having a lot of weight in the overall trend for the country is the Andes. But very concerning also, the Darien Highlands here, and the islands of San Andres and Providencia. And this is very concerning because these areas are very, very small, and they don't have national parks. They have other types of protected areas, but San Andres and Providencia, but no national parks. In terms of ecosystems, here is the overall trend for the country. Notice how well rainforest is doing. But that assessment, if we're going to do this now, the result might be different. So below that, doing really poorly and declining rapidly, freshwater birds and high Andean forest. And I have to say that we were very surprised that the avifauna that is doing worst is the avifauna in Paramo. And that's easily what happens because you have some regions that are very diverse. And Paramo is not that diverse, but it's the one that is doing worst. So this is, I have to say, this is the beauty of the red list indexes. And if you take the entire set of species for a particular type of ecosystem or region or taxonomic group, you decide the grouping you want to do. And here we have groups of species. The overall trend for the country, game birds, those that are hunted either for food or for sport. Parrots, you know how parrots look, large frugivores, and forest interior raptors and terrestrial insectivores, and I'm going to show just a couple of them. So these are all large frugivores, and most of them are also hunted. So this is a one, and they are hunted because they are large and tasty. And this is a terrestrial insectivore, an ant pita, a hooded ant pita. All right. So we know that the avifaunas of Paramo, high Andean forests, and freshwater ecosystems have indices below the national level, meaning that overall their species are more threatened. Freshwater species showing the greatest decline between 2002 and 2016. Most of those species are also located in the Andes. And the Andes, as I said, have the largest number of species. And two other regions that deserve very particular attention are the Darien Highlands on the border with Panama and the islands of San Andres and Providencia. We also found that compared to the overall number of species, relatively few species underwent genuine deterioration in their status. And the index for Colombia shows that the status is getting worse, but slowly. The global index is much worse. In fact, it is growing 416 faster than the rate for Colombia. And obviously, there are reasons for this. And island species is a reason for this, because island species are poorly represented in Colombia. And as you know, many island species are either extinct or highly threatened. So the weight of island species is much higher in the world than in Colombia. We have threatened species on islands, but they are not so many, and we have no extinction of island species, right? But also a contributing factor for this pattern is that the country still has a very large portion of native ecosystems in very good shape. For instance, 52% of the country is native forest today. 12% is savanna, natural savanna, and a little bit over 1% is paramount. And also, the country has a remarkable system of protected areas, not only national parks, but also regional reserves. We have, for us, national parks doesn't mean exactly what it means in Australia. They mean a higher level of protection, and they are for the entire country. Here you have a federal system, so national parks are from the states or territories. But over there, we have a national system, and we have regional systems. And there are also private reserves that are very important for these threatened species. So this is not to say that we are doing good. No, after all, we have 140 threatened species, which is not nice. And megadiversity comes with mega responsibility. And it doesn't necessarily comes with mega funding. So you have to be creative and have to make choices. How to use an index in a country like Australia? I think you have a very good idea by now, and I don't know if there is one for Australia, but you can identify the critical threats or critical regions or some groups of species to focus on. So this can be really useful in public policy, if you will. And what are the next steps is something that you can get a very good idea by using the index. And for us, an obvious next step is to do the next round of red data books. We are getting very close to the 10 years. All right. And I have two slides more, this one and another one. So this is essentially science with a purpose. And I have already touched on the impact of the research on public policy, but I would like to say a couple words about impact on conservation action and knowledge. So the publication of the red data books actually was very important for the establishment of new protected areas. Most of them regionally protected areas and private protected areas. And something that for us, I shouldn't say like totally unexpected, but very good. And the publication of the red data books actually have a significant impact on knowledge of those species. And there were two institutions that established small grant programs for the study of threatened species, not only birds, plants, mammals, whatever threatened species there are. And many young students, many people doing the research for their honors or their master programs conducted research on certain species, and then we know more about them, or not necessarily for their studies, but many young people went on to study these species, so that was nice. And this is one of the reasons why we have such a big, large number of changes in the categories due to better knowledge. And another thing that I would like to mention is that the interest on birds has increased in Colombia to a very high level, very rapidly. And threatened species and endemic species are the highlights for any birdwatching trip. And the Red Data Book had a very significant effect on that interest. And this is why I am studying motivations of people to do bird watching, because I think it is a good way to relate people with nature. And if you have a better understanding of nature, you may be more interested in conservation of nature. So that's what I'm doing. And I would like to say a word also, comparing the Red Data Books with the Red List Index in terms of the impact on public policy. So the Red Data Book were, I would say, very successful. Those species were declared threatened by the government. Protected areas were established. Some species are being managed based on information in those Red Data Books. So the impact was good. But I cannot say the same for the Red List Index, because, I mean, it was published in a nice journal. It has been cited, but not public policy. And the difference is that we, the authors, didn't have the time, opportunity to do the same networking that we did for the Red Data Books. That takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, really worth it, but we couldn't do it. So that makes a huge difference. And some final words. The underlying forces for the different threats operate at very different scales. Some of them at a finer scale, for instance, housing, and some of them operate at very large scales. For instance, illegal crops for cocaine, illegal mining for coal or coltan, and those are driven by international market forces beyond control for the country. And these illegal activities also undermine the capacity of the nation to achieve effective conservation action, because they not only destroy ecosystem and affect species, but also affect the government. Yeah. And also, I want to mention that in the year 2016, a peace agreement ended 50 years of armed conflict in Colombia with significant impact. So this opened opportunities for biodiversity conservation, local development based on birdwatching tourism, advancement in scientific knowledge, and not only on birds, basically everything, because people could go where they couldn't go for a long time. The sad part of that is that that has led also to dramatic increases in deforestation, because also people caught in the forest can go where they couldn't go before. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. That was fascinating. People have questions. So.
I will be very happy. No, very happy.
Are there some questions in the room? And Vicky, if there's any online, you can.
Thank you, Lewis. That was fantastic. Look, I was just wondering, you were talking about using the RLI to prioritise conservation actions. In New South Wales and New Zealand, they under the advice of Hugh Posting, who you've probably heard of, They use that type of information, but also the cost of conservation. So it's a benefit to cost ratio. It's formally adopted in New South Wales, and there's a species program to prioritise because, you know, obviously we don't have enough money to conserve everything. So I'm just wondering, have you thought of how you might take that to the next step in a policy sense?
I think my opinion is that depends a lot on who is paying. Because if you are the one who is paying, you want to have that analysis. But you are not. Why? And most conservation in Colombia is paid by the central government and the regional governments. And they get to decide where the money is allocated. And they are not necessarily paying attention to the scientists. And also, there is there are private research are very important. They are not big, but they are very crucially located. That group of people can be very strongly influenced by that type of analysis. So I wouldn't discourage doing that, but I would take it with a little bit of salt.
A couple of online questions. So Sho says, wonderful talk, Luis. Was very interested to learn about the parrot. Why are birds so threatened in this ecosystem?
All right. So we have few species, but some of them are in critical danger of extinction. And one of them is our national symbol, the condor, the Andean condor, that is very likely to go extinct in the near future, but it's not the only one. So that's why. So you have a set of species that is not very large. And if you have a couple of them really endangered, that has an important weight.
Another online question is, Claudia says, thank you for the presentation. I'd like to know if climate change as a threat was considered.
It should be considered. We didn't do it for these assessments that I showed because we didn't have resolution for that analysis. So think that some of these species, their distributions can be very small. And you don't have that type of resolution for this type of analysis. You may for some species, but you don't for others. And I like to give an example. There is this parrot, and you know parrots. Parrots are capable of flying very long and very well. And this parrot species has this very narrow distribution, range of distribution. That parrot can fly across that range of distribution in 10 minutes. But they don't go outside. So you really need fine data, really fine scale for some species. But no doubt, there is a big impact of climate change. And I don't want to stay there for long, but I live in Bogota. Bogota is at 2,600 meters above sea level, 2,600 meters. And you can see it before your eyes. So some of the species that we used to see, they are not there anymore. They above the elevation of Bogota. And there were some species that we didn't see, and we see it every day. So climate change does play a role.
Are there any more questions in the room? Yeah, off the bat.
Thank you very much for the informative presentation. I think you mentioned the habitat disruption is related to it's caused by some birds by economic reasons, economic aspects. And I was wondering how many, and you also mentioned that you have been making promoting collaboration among the various actors. So I wonder how many representative bodies or from economic side, for example, big firms or such alliances or whatever, how many bodies have been involved in the collaboration? If yes, I was very interested in how could you do that?
Fantastic question. Thank you so much. So, how to address it? The basic answer is obviously that people don't destroy the ecosystems because they mean to. It's because it's the byproduct of acquiring resources possibly. And many sectors are, well, I shouldn't say many sectors, but some sectors are interested in these issues. So they are collaborating with organizations that give them information. Something that is very important in Colombia and probably obviously in Australia is water. We have a really great abundance of water, but most of our energy comes from water. So water is crucial for everything. And those companies that manage water are very interested in collaborate with conservation. So they do it on a regional basis. But most sectors are not really interested. And I should say cattle ranching would be very, very, very important because they make up most of the land that is being used for something in Colombia. Usually very low densities of cattle, but that's something that should be done. But I am just a university professor, so yeah.
On that note, just a university professor. Thank you for a wonderful talk. We've come to the end of the time. Thank you for coming on.